You notice here in the New World Translation, the punctuation puts a stop after apart from him, not even one thing came into existence. Now again, contextually, we're talking about Genesis 1. Everything there. And again, all things often refers to all physical things. Not only here, like we've been talking about, contextually, in the beginning. But also, like I've referenced in Psalm 8, in Hebrews 1, all things being put below man's feet. That's all physical things. So there's not one single physical thing in the context of John's reference of the beginning of Genesis 1, where the Word is with God and all this is being done. None of the physical things that were made were done apart from the Word. And that's exactly what you see more descriptively in Proverbs 8 about wisdom. What Jesus is also called and was known by many in the early church for centuries. Right? They had different views. We don't have exactly the same view. Right? We believe it's pretty explicit that in Proverbs 8, wisdom is created first. Just like in the New Testament, Jesus is created first. Right? He's the character of God's being. He's the firstborn of all creation. He's the beginning of God's creation. He's the only begotten God, like we'll get to in part 16. These are all temporal terms. I mean, I don't know of a temporal term that was in existence and used at this time and frequently that isn't used of Jesus. And even more explicit statements like we'll get to later in John 5. But, so you have here a question of, how to punctuate this. And let's take a look at the Bible Hub and other translations of this. So, the New International Version, let's see if we can get kind of a New World Translation, New International Version. There we go. Kind of thing there. So this is verse 3 in the New World International Version. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. And then if we go over to verse 4 real quick, just to look at the New International Version. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. So, the New International Version, unlike the New World Translation, as you can see, apart from him, not even one thing came into existence. The New International Version, rather than make a separation like you see in the NWT up here, with the period after existence, the New International Version adds that last part in the NWT right here with its version of John 1:3. Right? So it makes a full stop at the end after including that part I've highlighted from the New World Translation that begins a separate sentence leading to verse 4. So notice the difference in the New International Version with the New World Translation. And let's go down to a couple other Bibles here. King James Bible, all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And let's take a look at the King James in verse 4. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. So similar to the New International Version. Let's see if we can find something that's more similar to the NWT. Looks like most of them want to create a separate sentence in verse 4, at least the version showing in the Bible Hub or at the Bible Hub. And so they're all making pretty much a full stop for their verse 3. I don't see an exception, except the contemporary English version. And this word, and with this word, God created all things. Nothing was made without the word. So this is similar to NWT right here in putting a period before everything that was created, which NWT does with what has come into existence. All right, so let's take a look at the contemporary English versions, verse 4. I want to make sure you understand the difference in the readings. Why the New World Translation and a couple others like the contemporary English version are different from the New International Version, the King James Bible. First, I want you to see clearly the difference. And then the rest should make more sense to you. Right, so the contemporary English version right here. Received its life from him, and his life gave life to everyone. Right, so it's a partial, it's continuing from verse 3, just like the NWT if you look up here. And so the contemporary English version, it looks like the only one of this list here. There's additional translations. Let's see. What else do we got down there? We're not going to go and look at every single one of them, right? But most of them. Let's see if that puts us back. Oh, now we got tons of translations, huh? All right, I guess more is better. But either way, I just kind of wanted to have that one column on the left for comparison. But we can look at those as well. So you can hopefully see the difference in how the New World Translation and a couple others, or at least one other in this list, the Contemporary English Version, punctuate and translate John 1:3 and John 1:4. And I'm going to explain more of what that difference is. In fact, let's go ahead and do that. I was going to show you an image of some of the early texts that reflect more or less this kind of punctuation in the English translations. But before I get to that, I'm going to read to you a section from the textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, 2nd edition, Bruce Metzger, United Bible Society Committee. I'm going to start on page 167. I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs. This is very important because I think they state well in their discussion the essential issues, and then I'll comment on it further. But listen carefully, and then we'll talk more about it. But I think they do a good job presenting the information so that we can then, have that discussion. All right, so starting on page 167, it talks about the reading from verses 3 to 4, and it says, should the words hagegonen, which has come to be joined with what goes before or with what follows? The oldest manuscripts, P66, P75, Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, have no punctuation here. Now that may not be correct, but we'll get to that in a moment. And in any case, the presence of punctuation in Greek manuscripts as well as in versional and patristic sources cannot be regarded as more than the reflection of current exegetical understanding and the meaning of the passage. Well, but that's important, right? I mean, if we're looking at texts, we're using these texts for our translation. Even if they present certain exegetical expressions like punctuation, that's still the transmission of the text as they understood it to be from either the original or the preceding copy. It may or may not be correct, but it's certainly important. A majority of the committee was impressed by the consensus of ante-Nicene early church writers, Orthodox and heretical alike, who took hagegonen, which has come to be, with what follows. When, however, in the 4th century, Arians and the Macedonian heretics began to appeal to the passage to prove that the Holy Spirit is to be regarded as one of the created things, Orthodox writers preferred to take hagegonen, which has come to be, with the preceding sentence, thus removing the possibility of heretical usage of the use of the passage. The punctuation adopted for the text is in accord with what a majority regarded as the rhythmical balance of the opening verses of the prologue, where the climactic or staircase parallelism seems to demand that the end of one line should match the beginning of the next. All right, so before we get to that, what I want to do is make sure you understand what he's talking about when he says that Metzger, of course, and probably most on the UBS committee, is a Trinitarian. Metzger. And what he's saying is the committee saw hagegonen, that which came to be in him, with what follows. They were impressed by that in the sense that there appeared to be a consensus among the early church fathers, Orthodox and heretical, in taking that which has come to be with verse 4. So you have the ending of verse 3, hagegonen, and then in verse 4, en auto, that which has come to be in him. So he's saying the majority of the committee was impressed by the ante-Nicene fathers' consensus, which appears to take hagegonen with verse 4, not as part of verse 3, right? So he's saying that the majority of the ante-Nicene fathers, the consensus among them, Orthodox and heretical, was basically to follow the NWT, to follow the New World Translation and take hagegonen, what has come to be, with verse 4. What has come to be in him, zoe ein, life was. What has come to be in him was life. Versus take hagegonen with the rest of verse 3. Let me go to that. I'm in verse 4 here in the Greek New Testament. So verse 3, apart from him came to be not one thing which has come to be. If that's taking hagegonen, that which came to be, has come to be, with the rest of verse 3. So the end of verse 3 is kai choris autou, egenetai ude en hagegonen. So if that's all one sentence, or the final part of verse 3 is one sentence, it's and apart from him came to be not even one thing which came to be. So which came to be in this case is reinforcing not even one thing. And so they're talking about in this respect how that was the preferred understanding. But then in the 4th century, what ended up happening was the Trinitarians started to react. They started to react to the so-called heretics, right? Maybe some were, maybe some weren't. But they didn't like the way the Arians and, according to Metzger, the Macedonian heretics were using the text to try to indicate that the way that the majority of ante-Nicene fathers were reading it proved that the Holy Spirit was a created thing. So, in this sense, you can see that the reaction of the Trinitarians is in large part responsible for the confusion that relates to this text and how it's to be understood or punctuated even. But let me go back to the additional explanation, because Metzger has a bracketed note that he adds to this section that obviously he wanted to put in there himself. Right after the part that I read about the rhythmical balance of the prologue. So, in this case, he goes on to say, on the other hand, responding essentially to himself, or at least to the committee's preferred explanation in this text. It's in brackets. On the other hand, however, none of these arguments, but it's initialed by Metzger, BMM on the next page. So this is Metzger, again, responding to basically his own textual commentary in the part that I read. On the other hand, however, none of these arguments is conclusive, and other considerations favor taking hagegonen, that which came to be, with the preceding sentence. Thus, against the consideration of the so-called rhythmical balance, which after all is present in only a portion of the prologue and may not necessarily involve hagegonen, must be set John's fondness for beginning a sentence or clause with en, and a demonstrative pronoun. And he lists several examples in John. It was natural for Gnostics who sought support from the fourth gospel for their doctrine of the origin of the Ogdoad to take hagegonen, that which has come to be, with the following sentence: that which has been made in him was life. Whatever that may be supposed to mean. The Metzger's questioning that. And I'm going to explain what that means in just a few moments. It is more consistent with the Johannine repetitive style as well as with Johannine doctrine, and he cites John 5:26 that we're going to get to say nothing concerning the sense of the passage, to punctuate with a full stop after ha gegonen. So that would mean that the text should read according to the majority of texts we've been reading in English here on the Bible Hub. At least that's what Metzger is trying to reinforce here. We're going to get to his reference of John 5:26 further in a moment and see what that has to say. And then there's a footnote that says, despite valiant attempts of commentators to bring sense out of taking hagegonen with what follows, that which has come into existence by means of him was life, versus not one thing came into existence that has come into existence, and then starting a whole new sentence in verse 4. Despite valiant attempts of commentators to bring the sense out of taking hagegonen with what follows, the passage remains intolerably clumsy and opaque. This is the footnote to what Metzger just wrote that I read on page 168. One of the difficulties that stands in the way of ranging the clause with en auto zoe ein, in him life was, is that the perfect tense of gegonen, which has come to be, would require estin instead of ein. So en auto zoe estin instead of ein. And says, see also the comment on 1:4. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. It would depend on John's perspective within the narrative and certain things, but it's certainly something to consider. And then in verse 4 it says, in order to relieve the difficulty of meaning when hagegonen, verse 3, is taken as the subject of ein, life was, in him was life, that which has come into being in him was life, the tense of the verb was changed from imperfect to present. So just like he was talking about in the footnote, in Sinaiticus, Codex D, the Old Latin, and in copies of the Syriac and Coptic, and many early ecclesiastical writers. This is page 168. The presence, however, of the second ein seems to require the first. And the second use of ein being hazoe ein taphos. The life was the light. All right, so I wanted to go over that discussion with you. Hopefully it made sense. I know a little bit of it is technical, but I gave you the reference. And I think it at least explains to some extent some of the issues involved with the translation and punctuation. Right? Do we take hagegonen, that which has come to be, with verse 4, that which has come to be in him was life? Or do we take hagegonen with the rest of verse 3, which is, apart from him came into being not one thing which has come into being? That would be taking hagegonen with the rest of verse 3 and then setting up a whole new sentence in verse 4, which would be, in him was life. Okay? So the difference primarily would be that it's not stating what has come to be in him was life. But I'm going to show that that doesn't make any difference ultimately. Because life did come to be in this one. He tells us. And we're going to read it ourselves. But now let me show you the thumbnail that I put up, which provides for us hopefully a good view of the part of John 1, 3, and 4 we've been talking about. right? So this top part, these are two different texts. One is P66, the top part, the lighter one. And the bottom one, the darker one, is P75. Let's just refer to them as 2nd to 3rd century papyrus. Okay? 2nd to 3rd century papyri. There's some question in particular about P75, about whether it's, 3rd, 4th century or earlier than that. But I'm going to refer to them as credibly datable to the 2nd, possibly 3rd century, showing the text of John, specifically the part we're talking about and that we've been reading about primarily, where the punctuation and translation is concerned. So in P66, right, a text 100 to 200 years after John probably wrote his gospel or great message, maybe up to 250 years. Still pretty close. Here you have, make sure it's showing on your screen, on the far left here where my cursor is. You look here, this is the part where it says, came to be not one, or it came to be nothing, right? If you notice here, right between that E, epsilon, right here in the middle, where my cursor is circling, there's an epsilon and a nu. Looks like an E and an N. So this says right here, egeneta, ude, or uden. When there's a vowel following a consonant at the end like this, it's sometimes because the consonant's added to another term that ends in a vowel. And so here you have came to be nothing, but there's supposed to be a term here, N, or let me just pull up verse 3. I'm sorry, hen. But it doesn't appear to be here in P66. Now, some people believe between this E and N you have a dot right there. It does look like there's a dot, doesn't it? There's a dot up here, looks like, in a space. And the way I read this text, there's kind of like a flowing space right here. Not so much here, although there's kind of a mark here. Here there's a space. Here there's a space. It's kind of on an angle, right? Flowing from this top, sort of like that. But over here again, so agenata, ude, or uden. If it's either way, there doesn't appear to be a hen here, or an epsilon nu. We wouldn't see the rough breathing, so you'd just see N. But we see uden, or ude, and then an N, right? If this is a punctuation mark, if this is an upper point, indicating a stop of some kind, or a pause at least, then you have a sort of just a dangling nu, right? Because there's no epsilon to go with that nu to create hen. And came to be not nothing, not one thing. Right? The word one isn't there. And if this is a dot, indicating a pause or a stop after this epsilon, and this is ude, then this nu has nothing to do because there's no epsilon to go with it. Now it does fit with uden as the nu that's added after the vowel, epsilon. Before this is an omicron. Kind of looks like an alpha a little bit. It's got a little tail there. It's actually an omicron with no breathing, right? So it's ha, but it's just an omicron. Ha gegonen right here. Here's ha gegonen. So this looks like egeneta uden. Ha gegonen. Came to be nothing. And then there looks like a pause here. Now there's not a dot like there is up here. So this could be ha gegonen. This could be, and apart from him came to be nothing. What came to be in him, life was. Right? There's Zoe, Ein. And then there's Taphos. So P66, just the way it reads, not necessarily the punctuation. I don't believe this is a punctuation dot. It might be. If you look closely, for example, right above this epsilon, that's part of ude, uden, nothing. The word one is not here in P66. And I believe that's what proves that this is not a punctuation mark right here. It's a little bit different than this over here, right? And this one over here. It's not as full. And if you notice, this here, this epsilon here and here, look at them. Right? They end over here, up in this corner, or you can't see it. But these two right here, part of this agenita. It looks like the pen leaks, doesn't it? It kind of leaks forward. Leaves like a trail. Both of them. And I think that's what you have right here with this epsilon. It's kind of over here and this epsilon as well. In gegonen. That middle line of the epsilon kind of goes far. I think that's an extension of the line from the epsilon in P66 right here. Just like over here, again, you see this epsilon over here to the left, that extended line. And you can see it right here, even in the faded epsilon right here. Not so much here, but you have that T, the top bar on the T on the tau. So maybe they stopped right there because they didn't want to run into the top bar of the tau. So I think that's what that is, because otherwise, again, you have a dangling nu. It doesn't attach to another epsilon so that you could form the word hen, one. Like you see down here in P75. Here it is, right? Egeneta ude en ha gegonen. See that right there? So I'm on the bottom image now, right in the middle of the bottom image. Right here, you see this epsilon I'm circling? That begins the word egeneta. This is egeneta. This is the word, the pronoun autu. Because, right? It's talking about apart from him came to be, ageneta, ude. Right here's ude. Nothing. Here's uden, right? Because it puts the nu there, which happens when you have a vowel following a vowel. But here, you don't have that nu. And you have another word. Hen. It shows just N. Again, epsilon, nu, but the rough breathing. It's the word one. It's like what we read in most of our translations. Apart from him came to be not one thing. And then you have this little, there's just a little blur here. A neat blotch of some kind. And then here's the article, or the pronoun. Apart from him came to be not one thing, P75 on the bottom, ha gegonen. That's not the article, it's the pronoun. Or relative pronoun. What, who, that which came to be. In him was life. Right at the bottom here, the lower left. Life was. There's the omega of the zoe. There's the zeta. Right, so is everyone following me? I hope it makes sense. Because let me go over it real quickly. Again, agenata uden. Apart from him came to be nothing. No N. So P66, probably our earliest papyrus of this text, doesn't use the word one. It does appear to put a space or a pause at least. Doesn't have this punctuation mark though. But there's definitely a space. That doesn't necessarily mean there's a separation or pause though. Because again, there's sort of this, I've been pointing out, this declining space flow here from top to bottom, although you have that mark up here and over here with another space. Either way, we'll leave the significance of the dot and the space aside for now and just note the reading of P66 is, apart from him came to be nothing. What came to be in him was life. That's how I read P66. It could also be read, apart from him came to be nothing which came to be. And then you start verse 4. In him was life. Anauto zoe ein. P75. Let me make sure you guys can all see this. Yeah, it looks like you can see it. Apart from him, autu came to be agenata ude en hagegonen. Apart from him came to be not one thing which came to be. I'm not saying, I didn't read it that way necessarily because it's the most natural, although that certainly, there's not the spacing you have up here in P66, right? So you can see why it's a more natural just to keep reading, but that was often how these texts were written, without a space or even punctuation. So it's difficult to say. You do have N, right? So you have, apart from him came to be not one thing which came to be. Or, apart from him came to be not one thing. That which came to be in him was life. So again, in both of these early papyri of John, papyrus of John, collectively, papyri, right, the plural, we can't say for sure what the reading or translation should be. But I think collectively, if we had to take a look at the weight of the evidence, I'm not so sure John needs or needed to state with such emphasis and re-emphasis what he already made plain. That not even one thing or nothing, if we don't use one, like P66, that was made in Genesis 1 was done without the word. Nothing. Just like we read in Proverbs 8, when after the word wisdom was made. Wisdom's involved with everything. Putting things together with Jehovah. Wisdom's father. And here we have the word with his father.